Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, in which we will continue exploring functional neurological disorders. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Professor Robert Baloh, author of the book titled Medically Unexplained Symptoms, A Brain-Centered Approach. And the focus will be on mass psychogenic illness, but we're going to talk a lot about psychogenic illnesses generally. We'll talk about other things coming up from Dr. Baloh's bio. He is well known as a leader in the field of neurotology. After completing his neurological training at UCLA in 1972, he joined the faculty at the UCLA School of Medicine with a joint appointment in neurology and head and neck surgery in 1973. Dr. Baloh became professor in 1982, distinguished professor in 2002, and emeritus professor in 2021. He has authored 15 books, over 350 articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals, over 100 book chapters, and he's a pioneer in the study of the vestibular system, the inner ear brain system, which helps people to maintain their sense of balance and spatial awareness. He has trained more than 40 fellows who are now leaders in the field of vestibular research in their own rights. Dr. Baloh also has a long-standing interest in the history of neurology and has written extensively on the subject. Among his many honors, he has received the Hallpike Nyland Prize at the Bírani Institute at the Bírani Society meeting in Prague in 1992, and had an International Dizziness and Balance Symposium in his honor at the 2014 American Academy of Neurology meeting in Philadelphia. His book, Clinical Neurophysiology of the Vestibular System, written with Vincenti Honrubia, is currently in the 4th edition and is the standard in the field. His other books include Dizziness, Hearing Loss and Tinnitus, The Essentials of Neurotology, 1984, Neurotology, 1994, Dizziness, Why Do You Feel Dizzy and What Will Help You Feel Better, 2016, and Vertigo, 5 Physician Scientists and the Quest for a Cure, that's 2017. I will be interested to hear of the cure of vertigo. And recently, he became interested in the boundary between neurology and psychology with the publication of Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness and the Real Story Behind the Embassy, Mystery and Hysteria. And that's with Robert Bartholomew in 2020. And of course, the book we're talking about today, Medically Unexplained Symptoms, published in 2021. And there is also a recent book about exercise and brain health, published just this couple of years ago. Dr. Baloh, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm very glad you could join me, and I'm very honored that you've accepted my invitation today.
Thank you, Edwin. I'm glad to be with you.
Okay. Why did you write the book on medically unexplained symptoms? What kind of brought you to that field from neurotology to...
As you mentioned, in 2020, along with Robert Bartholomew, who's a sociologist in New Zealand, we wrote a book on Havana syndrome, which we concluded was most likely a example of mass psychogenic illness, and that there was a lot of misunderstanding about psychogenic illness, both by the public, but also by physicians. I was impressed with that, and I really felt that there was an area that needed to be addressed. And I began reading and working on that area. And of course, the additional factor was that I've been seeing dizzy patients. I was known as the dizzy doctor. I saw dizzy patients. That's what I saw throughout my career, 50 years of seeing patients with dizziness. It was obvious to me that a great number of them, actually, after extensive medical testing, we had no clear medical diagnosis. And that was so-called medically unexplained symptoms, MUS. So I was very much aware of the problem. We use terms like psychophysiologic dizziness and the terms changed over the years for the same condition. Most recently, it has been PPPD, persistent postural perceptual dizziness. This is another ill-defined term, but it's some type of psychophysiologic dizziness. But in addition, many patients had benign symptoms like near faint dizziness, which is universally present in just about everybody at some point. And so it's such a common symptom, and yet many times we had no good explanation for it. So that's how I got to writing the book.
Okay. And the first thing that struck me was, and I'm going to quote you there, you said, it is actually more normal to have symptoms than not to have symptoms. And it kind of sounds counterintuitive. We assume we're all okay until something happens and we have a symptom. Can you explore that a bit for me?
Well, certainly I have symptoms just about every day. I'm old, so I guess maybe one might attribute it to that. But I would imagine you may well have symptoms on at least occasional basis. Indeed, most people do have symptoms on a regular basis. I guess the big four are back pain, headache, fatigue, and dizziness. Those are the big four. And it's surprising how common those symptoms are in the general public. There was a recent study, actually, was done in about 10 years ago now. Time flies by. A telephone survey in New Zealand asking subjects about symptoms they've experienced, just a random sampling of normal people, symptoms they've experienced in the last two weeks. And 90% reported some symptoms, and the great majority of those had multiple symptoms. It was only 10% of the people that were interviewed said they had no symptoms in the past 2 weeks. And again, those are the big four were the symptoms that they had most often, but they had a lot of other symptoms as well. There have been many other studies also looking at just the change in pattern of symptoms over the years and over the centuries. And there's no question that people today complain of symptoms much more than people did 100 years ago. There have been several studies that have actually surveyed the same people in populations over time. And so it is more common to have symptoms now. And people tend to interpret symptoms more as due to medical conditions, so-called medicalization of symptoms. It's extremely common. It's so that in the past, people they would have symptoms, but they didn't make much of them. Now we make more of them. We tend to want to attribute them to some medical condition. Of course, I'm sure that the internet and Google has something to do with that, because if you go to Google and Google your latest symptom, you're going to be frightened, and shortly after, probably wanting to see a doctor immediately, or you're sure you have this or that. So it's common to have symptoms. People are more bothered by symptoms. People are attributing symptoms to medical conditions much more commonly.
And does it matter whether we call them symptoms or something else? Does that, by calling these symptoms, does that help to medicalize whatever it is that people get? Or
well, I mean, it's you call so they are symptoms. They actually are reasons why people go to doctors. In fact, I mean, as I say, the big four. Those are the symptoms. If you were going to be in, I mean, as a neurologist, even, I mean, but general practice, those are going to be, almost half the people you see are going to have one of those four symptoms that they come in. And the chances are, after you do all of your testing, you're not going to have a clear biological explanation for the symptoms. Indeed, this is, the history. I mean, I've been interested in the history of medicine for a long time, and I mean, the medical system has evolved over the centuries, so that certainly in the last 100 years, we want to focus on the biological. We we are taught in medical school, in fact. I mean, to focus on, we should have a biological explanation for everything.
Yes.
But of course, 100 years ago, there was almost no biological explanation for anything. And yet the symptoms were pretty much the same, how we focused on them. And I think that that all symptoms really are some combination of biological and psychosocial. I mean, whether they're primarily psychosocial or whether they're primarily biological, but none of them are purely one or the other. And even if you have cancer and have symptoms, your psychosocial situation is going to affect how you experience the symptoms, how serious they are. And if it's the pure so-called psychophysiologic or psychosomatic symptoms, there are always biological elements, particularly genetics. I mean, certain people clearly are more susceptible to psychosomatic symptoms than other people. Their psychosocial background is important, but their genetic background and is we get some of. I mean, this always when we get into outbreaks of psychosomatic illness, like mass psychogenic illness. There's some people will have real symptoms of some illness involved, or some symptoms that were related to illness, and then of course this can start to spread, and other people will develop the symptoms without having the particular illness that initially started. So it's a complicated business to say that somebody has just psychosomatic or they have a biological. I think we have to come back to a model more of the psychosocial biological model, where we look at all of these aspects for all symptoms. And it's going to be some combination. And we have, as physicians, we have to deal with that combination.
Yeah, you talked about it being a complex interaction between nature and nurture. At what stage do these symptoms, which a vast majority of people have, becomes pathological? When does it become a psychosomatic problem? Is there a threshold? I know we talked about...
No, I don't think. I think it's a continuum. I mean, that's, as I said, that's the problem. It's not like it suddenly becomes pathological, or I guess you could say it's always pathological, or it always isn't. I mean, there's a complete continuum across the spectrum from biological to psychosocial. It really depends on the individual, how it affects them. And a lot of that is based on their beliefs and their expectations. That's so critical. You see, the human brain is quite different from a computer. And we don't, when we set down memories, we don't have a memory bank that we just put them in there and then we pull them out as pure memories that are exactly correct and factual. Everything we learn is based on changing the synapses in our brain, the chemical and physical connections between neurons in feedback pathways. And so when we learn something new, we are just modifying what's already in there to some degree. And that's also highly dependent on our backgrounds of expectations and beliefs, so that we think we have facts in our brains, but these facts are highly affected by what we expect or what we believe. I mean, and that, of course, is really important when it comes to how we deal with symptoms.
Yeah, and these patterns and expectations, are there those that are benign and those that are more likely to lead to psychosomatic illness, or it's just across the board?
Well, I think, yes. I mean, so there could be some. I mean, one of the really great examples of this, and just to get in, I think it gives a good feeling for it, is the idea of a placebo and nocebo. Now, just about everybody's heard of a placebo, which is you take a sugar pill, and if you believe it really works, it's going to make you feel better, and you do feel better. But its evil twin is the nocebo, and this is if you are told you have something and you possibly have some bad illness, you're going to start to have symptoms, and you're going to be very ill. And the best example of that is what we've done, and I've been involved in many controlled treatment trials over my career. And always we can expect at least about a third of the placebo group, comparing, because you have to compare placebo versus the intervention, usually a medication. But you have to give a placebo. That's been a tradition now for some 40, 50 years. And we know about a third of the people will respond to the placebo, at least a third, up to 2/3, between a third and 2/3, depending on the drug that you're testing and the underlying situation, of course, of the individuals. But then there's the other side of it. We also know, and having done these many studies, that if you tell the people what to be looking for in terms of side effects, that's part of the study typically, because you have to keep track of the side effects that are going to occur in the study. And if you tell them, you have to be on alert for these particular symptoms, they might be a side effect. At least a third, and again, between a third and 2/3, will develop in the placebo group, will get symptoms, side effects.
Okay.
Always the placebo group patients, even though they've not received any medication, will complain of the side effects that you have outlined that they had to be on the alert for. That's the nocebo effect. And the nocebo effect is really important with psychosomatic symptoms. I mean, it just illustrates that. And just tell someone, if you tell someone that they swallowed the rat poisoning, they'll most likely start to get nausea and feel really bad. And so the knowledge or the concept is enough to trigger off symptoms. And just about all symptoms, the nocebo effect is involved, because that's how you are interpreting. So if you have a symptom, if you interpret it as being possibly a bad sign, such as the first sign of cancer, you're going to feel much worse and be affected much greater than if you say, oh, it's nothing to worry about.
So, I mean, both the placebo and nocebo effects are generated by the brain. And you said, psychosomatic and real symptoms, organic symptoms, are as real as each other. Why can't the body distinguish between something that is an illness that's, I would say it's a threat to the health, and something that is psychosomatic, which isn't? Is there something wrong with the way the body is set up that you can't distinguish between these two?
Well, indeed, that is the problem, and it's a complicated answer, and there's multiple factors. But it is true, though, that the same brain pathways can be activated by psychosomatic symptoms and organic symptoms. And probably the best example, I mean, the best area that we have studied and have a lot of good information is pain. We know how pain is organized in the brain. It's very complex, and large parts of the brain are involved in pain perception and in how we interpret pain. There's, for example, large numbers of pain centers in the base of the brain and in the cortex. And we know that the limbic system, the brain emotional system, the amygdala, the fear center in the limbic system, is highly interrelated and connected with this central pain pathway. In fact, one area that we do know, so-called central pain hypersensitivity, which I think most people agree is what happens in fibromyalgia, is the central pain pathways are extremely overactive, and so that any signal coming in is going to set up a much greater activity within the pain pathways than normally is the case. Now, how that happens, there's a lot of factors involved in that, and some of it is an input from the limbic system. Fear, stress can make your pain pathways hyperactive. But in addition, there are inhibitory pain pathways, and then the classic one is the descending pain modulatory system. That's what multiple centers in the brainstem, throughout the brainstem, that feed back down onto the spinal cord and can actually shut off the pain signals coming in from the periphery. And that system has endogenous opioids. That's one of the major neurotransmitters in that system. And that explains how opioids actually can shut down pain. They activate that system and shut it down. But it's also activated by your beliefs and your expectations and in your limbic system. How much fear and anxiety is there will affect that. So that we know that some people can undergo surgery just by the acupuncture because they believe that acupuncture is an anesthesia. They use that system and shut off the pain pathways coming in. So it's a remarkable system in that the pain or whatever peripheral input can activate it, which is what we think pain, that there should be some signal coming in or some cause for the pain. But you can have that same pain and even worse pain on a central basis without any signal coming in. Now, central hypersensitization does get activated often by chronic pain signals coming in to the signal, but that's only one of many. It can be activated from pure central mechanisms, from the limbic system as well. So the brain pathways are similar, whether it's an actual damage to some organ or some part of your arm or leg, or whether it's coming from your expectations and your level of stress and anxiety in the brain. But you have the same kind of pain. And the key centers that really give you the experience of pain in the brain are going to be active, regardless of how they were initially activated.
I can guess. I mean, that's where the idea that it's not all in your head; it's actually going on.
Yeah, well, that's one of the big things that I over and over. I mean, one of the, and I'm sure that would come up with other questions you have, but the notion, and this is what it started me into this initially, because many physicians, that's their response is they do their tests. There's no findings that they can explain it, and it's it must be all in your head. And if you want to turn a patient off, and guarantee you're not going to help them, just say to them, "Oh, it's nothing. The tests are all normal. It's all in your head," because then you have an antagonist patient and you're not going to be able to provide any help. Because really, there's no question about the importance of reassurance. And if you could use it that way and simply say, well, all right, the tests are normal, and so I can reassure you, there's not any signs of anything really going on, but we need to work on the pain or whatever the other symptoms. We can deal with it, we can help. But it just reassuring, because that's 100 years ago, that's all physicians could do, and they did a pretty darn good job, but not much worse than what we're doing now. So I think being able to provide reassurance, particularly with things like mass psychogenic illness, which you may want to get into, but that is it is the answer, really. But in order to do that, though, you have to be able to be sure. You need to take all symptoms seriously. I mean, that is one of the key issues, I think, is you can't jump to the conclusion that symptoms are psychosomatic initially. I mean, you have to, like any symptoms, it's going to have some combination of biological, psychosocial, but you have to take them seriously, make sure that there's not any other explanation. And then once that seems pretty clear, then you need to work on the psychophysiologic and the social aspects and try to reassure the patient and that there's not anything serious going on.
Well, you also talked about the flip side of investigating, and that is finding non-specific incidental abnormalities, which you said can reinforce the patient's fear. It's kind of a fine balancing act, isn't it? How do you kind of reassure a patient who is worried about mild things when you pick up? For neurology, we pick up.
It is a big problem, and one of the another example too is we often use questionnaires in medicine. I mean, often patient goes, while he's sitting in the doctor's office, you give him a questionnaire, to check off all these things. But as a physician, I learned very early on that really had little to do with what the patient was complaining about or didn't give me much information, because the patients either would check everything, or some would, and a few would check nothing. But the point is, and there have been studies showing that the ones that check everything, really, they're the worried well. And there are a lot of those that are just people with a lot of symptoms, and they're worried about them, and that's what they're focusing on. But that is not a good, indication of what's really bothering them, or what is the cause of their problem.
Yes.
So it is a difficult problem, and I think the other big thing, the physicians, certainly in the United States, and it's probably to some degree even in places like England where there's socialized medicine, the physicians are reimbursed. They have time limits. And then their reimbursement is based on procedures. I mean, like in the United States, procedures get you like 5 times more reimbursement than talking to patients. And with psychosomatic symptoms, you have to talk to people, yes. And it takes a lot of time. And with the current system, where many primary care doctors get 15 minutes with a new patient, and there's strict limits on all aspects. It is really very difficult to address psychosomatic. And so that's the answer is don't address it. Just say, well, we do all these tests. Sometimes they're not even talking about after the tests are over, if they're all negative, what does that mean? The patient is told by the nurse, oh, the tests are all negative, but there's nothing to worry about, I guess, or whatever. And of course, that doesn't reinforce the patient's ideas.
Yeah. So it's pre-counseling and then talking after, I suppose that's the solution. One of the topics you covered was multiple chemical sensitivity, which develops from perceived exposure to low levels of commonly used chemicals. In such cases, when there's a real or an actual exposure to something and the tests are normal, how does one feel confident to say, actually, this is psychosomatic and not a sub-threshold problem going on?
Well, it does get back to what we talked about a little before, and also what I would address as for mass psychogenic illness, because in a way it's kind of overlaps. Is you really have to take it seriously at the beginning. I mean, you have to, because otherwise you're going to get in trouble if you ignore and just say, oh, that must be chemical hypersensitivity, or the person is overreacting. So you need to at least initially evaluate the person and make sure there isn't some toxin. Of course, it has to do with also the description of what the symptoms are and how it fits with what you know about known toxins. But in addition, you'd have to do a toxic screen and so many times and so forth initially. But you also have to have this in your mind, at least right from the start. I mean, it's part of the spectrum of what you have to be considering. But initially, you're going to try to be sure that you cover all the bases and that you're taking it as seriously. But if after your all the tests that you look at, there's no sign of the toxin, and you're seeing a pattern that fits more with some kind of a mass psychogenic response or something like that, then you have to be open to that. You see, this is one of the problems I see, is that very often that's not even considered, or they really don't want to consider it, because that's going to raise a whole host of other problems to deal with. So, but I think it is not, like all areas of medicine, you have to start, listen to the history, get all the information and whatever tests are going to be required to be sure you're not missing something like a toxin, which would be terrible if somebody was exposed to some toxin and you told them, oh, it's all in your head, or psychosomatic. That's going to be worse than about any other thing that can happen in medicine.
It's it is something that as neurologists we're facing more and more is this question of FND. And one of the things you mentioned was how a few index patients provide a template for the great majority of people with psychogenic illness. I suppose this is now the borderline of FND and mass psychogenic illness. How does this happen? What's the driver for this mimicry? It's where subsequent patients.
Well, it's an interesting topic, and the history of this is remarkable, actually, because it fits in with the history of neurology in Charcot. Charcot, who often is considered the father of neurology, Charcot was fascinated with hysteria, and he wrote and was certain there was going to be some neurologic abnormality or some brain abnormality to explain it. But one thing he did, I mean, he described his so-called hysteric patients and hysteria very well. But what he noted is if he put a patient with the diagnosis of hysteria in the ward with seizure patients, that they immediately would have the same seizures as the patients next to them in the bed had. And so the mimicry of this goes back and is well documented over many years. What's fascinating about that is that when he actually finally died and left, the next neurologist took over for him, said, "Look, we don't allow any hysteric seizures in this hospital," and they just stopped immediately. The patients started to have other symptoms, but they didn't have the hysterical seizures anymore. And so it's a complicated interaction between the patient and the physician, even in terms of what kinds of symptoms are going to be expressed and how. But I mean, it's well known that there are many examples in doctor's offices, patients seeing another patient in the waiting room with some symptom, and then they just by the time they go and see the doctor have acquired that symptom themselves. So it is part of this psychosocial aspect, and and I'm sure it's interrelated with this nocebo kind of effect. If you expect or if you think you may have something, then you start focusing on it and you amplify certain brain circuits. Then before long, you have the same symptom that the other person had.
So the patients Charcot he had a large collection of them, didn't he, in his ward? But with mass psychogenic illness, that's a completely different thing. We'll come to the Havana syndrome, but one of the ones that fascinated me was the Belgian CocaCola mass psychogenic illness, which you talked about. And this wasn't too far away. It was in the 1990s. It was very expensive for Coca-Cola. I don't remember. Well, I thought I should be old enough to hear about it. What exactly happened then? What was the setting for this illness?
Well, initially, some young girls were drinking Coca-Cola, and they indicated it smelled funny. There was this odor, and before long they were nauseated and they were vomiting and they were complaining of being ill. And this just mushroomed gradually, start from just being school children to then parents became affected, and it started to spread throughout all of Europe, from country to country, whereby it ended up where Coca-Cola had to be. It was withdrawn from the shelves from all of the countries, and the company initially tried to deal with it, and of course there were general rules about how companies should react to something like this, and so they did some testing, and they said, well, maybe one of the plants there might have been some hydrogen sulfite, a very small amount, but got into the Coke that made it have this odor, but really it shouldn't harm any. But that even they seemed to people were suspicious of the company as it was, and then of course there were the media was all over the media throughout Europe, and they kept saying, Coca-Cola in the media, it's always, a definite thing. The Coca-Cola made these people sick, and that was headlines
Black and
throughout
white.
and then the doctors too. I mean, one good example was a doctor called into the poison control centers just asking about whether there was any evidence of hemolysis, which is like breakdown of red blood cells in the blood, which is often a clear sign of toxicity. And then the poison control center ran some tests, and they did find some hemolysis in like 10 cases, and that was reported. And then that was just really like throwing fuel on the fire. But it turned out it was an artifact. It was just the test was inappropriately done, and it was wrong. But that was another factor that set it off. So all of these things combined to make it one of the largest epidemics of mass psychogenic illness.
Oh.
But gradually, as often happens with this, people start to think about it, and then they said, well, this does fit with mass psychogenic illness, and people who were knowledgeable about that, and they started to write articles and clearly show how this evolved. And then slowly the newspapers and the media started to accept it. And once that happened, then it was pretty gradual. Over several years it took before they were able to convince governments and get Coca-Cola back on the shelves and get the whole thing back to normal.
I suppose Pepsi made hay while the sun was shining. Pepsi, the great competitor of Coke, I suppose, would have raked in millions at that time.
What would happen with it certainly wasn't anything unique to Coca-Cola. So similar things have happened with other beverages.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that there's sort of the idea of odors and noises being involved in triggering psychogenic illness and mass psychogenic illness. And it's interesting because the human evolution, those are two things. Sounds and smells are built into our limbic system as being dangerous, and we tend to be attuned to that in our brains, which are evolved for a different era than we currently live in. If you had an unusual smell or if you heard some unusual sounds, you should be really worried and fearful. And that's what happens with a lot of these mass psychogenic illness episodes. The fear of some odor or sounds sets it off, and then it becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah, talking about sounds, the Havana syndrome is all about this sonic thing that people heard. That
was a good example. The first few people who were actually CIA agents heard they in Cuba they heard some unusual sounds, and in fact, what's interesting of the first like 16 to 20 of the initial people that were made ill by these sounds, or they attribute them to the sounds. They actually recorded the sounds.
Okay.
They made physical recordings of them, and then they sent them off to experts in auditory investigations, and they concluded there were several different groups that looked at them, that they concluded they were actual sounds of insects, like cricket sounds, that they were recording, but they thought that was the sound that was setting off their symptoms. And of course, what happened is then after the initial thing, the government told everybody going there and then starting other embassies around the world, you ought to be on alert for if you hear any unusual sounds, you may develop these symptoms. And the so-called nocebo effect. That's what happened. They started to have these symptoms, and so it was now not in just Havana, but in Europe, Asia, just all over the world, including downtown Washington, D.C., like supposedly, we're having these which they attributed them to some enemy weapon, was being used around the world and targeting these people. And that's still a theory that is being propagated in some of the press yet, and some people still are holding on to that, although they pretty much gave up on that sound weapon, a sonic weapon, because sonic weapons don't damage brain. So they moved over and changed to microwaves. So then through the microwaves, some microwave weapon is actually being used. It's causing it. And it ties in with the sound because this bizarre phenomenon that if you, certain microwaves frequencies can activate the inner ear directly to produce some clicking sounds.
Okay.
So it is a known phenomena, but it doesn't at all explain. The sounds they're describing, though, have nothing to do with that kind of sound. But that's, again, how people are using that to try to, again, explain this syndrome, which is still, after now 5-6 years, there's not any evidence of a weapon. And, of course, what kind of weapon could be used all around the world, focusing on people without anybody ever seeing evidence of a weapon or even any evidence that such a weapon exists?
Does logic have to take a holiday for mass psychogenic illness to take root? Because it looks like there's always a logical fallacy behind most of these mass psychogenic illnesses. The embassy, the American embassy, did they kind of not think through it, or did they have enough evidence?
I mean, this is one of the problems, of course, is the pressure on the government and of course many physicians involved in the initial thing is these people, and it's true, they have symptoms, and the symptoms are real. That's the other. We got into it, the symptoms are as real as any other symptoms. But there's this notion, and as initially came out, many of the physicians said, and certainly many of the government, these are very strong people who are selected out, and how could they're not imagining symptoms. It's not possible. They couldn't have such symptoms occur. Well, there's no question that everybody's susceptible to psychosomatic symptoms, and certainly to mass psychogenic illness. It's not some sign of weakness. And if you have the government and physicians reinforcing it by telling people, yes, you have. I mean, in this case, there were multiple neurological studies done initially, a couple of articles published in JAMA, a prominent medical journal, indicating there was brain damage. But again, when one goes back and looks at it, there was no evidence of it at all. These were over-interpreting tests and procedures, and there really was no evidence of brain damage. In fact, more recently, the NIH conducted a study of several hundred of these people and had a control group, and they could find no evidence of brain impairment of any kind compared to the control group. But that's still not enough because, again, it's still there, and people still are proposing there's weapons involved. It becomes very complicated, of course, when the lawyers are involved and the legal system. So, I mean, and it becomes, the government, the simplest thing is just, you certainly give in to it. I mean, it's much easier than trying to make it, and it takes such a long time because here we are 6 years after the initial Havana syndrome cases. And I would say, still the government has not come out and said that this was mass psychogenic illness, even though the majority of the government agencies now have concluded that's the most likely explanation.
And you talked about your studies with your colleague Robert Bartholomew. And a lot of it, I think he wrote a book on mass anxiety in schools, I think. Are children in schools particularly vulnerable to mass psychogenic illness? Because the Coca-Cola one started with young girls, wasn't it? Are they more vulnerable? I know the Havana syndrome is different, but by and large, are children and schools more vulnerable?
There are quite a few different sort of mass psychogenic scenarios, but it is probably the most common, as you point out, is young schoolgirls, although it's certainly not just girls. There's some school epidemics have involved both girls and boys, but then there's also outbreaks in boys' schools or in also military training groups are vulnerable. It often is a group. If there's a background stress, that's a factor invariably. Young children, they're much more susceptible. They're dealing with a lot of change, a lot of stress occurring, and they are less sophisticated, of course, about medical symptoms and what the meaning and so forth. So they're more vulnerable to some degree, but by no means is this mass psychogenic illness unique to them. I mean, one of my best stories that I recall with the young girls with mass psychogenic illness, they were in the southern United States. And it also gives a background of how we think about football, our football. Is the girls and the cheerleaders and the girls in the band, huge number, maybe 30 or 40 at halftime came out, and one of them fainted, and then it went through the entire group. The field was covered with young girls who had fainted, having seen the other girls faint, and they brought in large numbers of ambulance, put them in the ambulance, took them off to the hospital, and then began the second half of the game right after they cleared the field. So it was an example there where they didn't really get too excited about the mass fainting, but fainting is one of the more common symptoms in schoolgirl episodes of mass psychogenic illness. One faints and another sees the person faint, and then they get nauseated and faint, and it just can kind of cascade. And it's a normal physiologic response that is occurring.
I wonder whether people like that would have very highly active mirror neurons in their brain to kind of faint because somebody else has fainted. Has that been?
I think near faint is having, as I said, been a dizzy doctor for years. Surprisingly, a large percentage of the patients that I would see, even though I was an ears neurology specialist, they had simple near faint dizziness. It's just doctors send off to, you have dizziness, you go to the dizziness doctor. But these common things like near faint dizziness, which just about everybody experiences, it's surprising, that many doctors will just, nowadays, the primary care doctors are essentially triage officers to send patients to different specialists. But once they get into a specialist, of course, you send a patient with near faint dizziness to an otolaryngologist, it could be trouble. Could be a surgery involved at some point. That's how the system works.
One thing that crops up, it's the issue of chronic fatigue syndrome, which you've talked about earlier on. But what happened in the 1960s and 1970s? Would you describe that as kind of an epidemic of chronic fatigue syndrome then? Or is it?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, it's the first cases actually occurred in London, and that was called myalgic encephalopathy, or I forget the ME.
Yeah, ME.
So in England it was called ME, and in the United States it came in as chronic fatigue syndrome, and then gradually there was just a combination of the two, and we call it ME/FS CFS. But the first cases in England actually occurred in a hospital during an epidemic, an infectious epidemic, that the nurses and doctors started to become ill, which is kind of interesting that that would be the beginning. But it was a nurse and a doctor, and then it kind of spread like 250 of the staff members at the Royal Free Hospital in London became ill. And then it started to spread around, and there were examples of this occurring in other polio epidemics in America. They would have so people taking care of them would develop symptoms, but they never got the severe symptoms or the typical symptoms of the polio or the other infectious disease, but they looked something like it. And so the doctors and nurses had to deal with their fellow people who had these symptoms. It was very complicated. The majority of them, of course, they're short-lived. They got better, but then a small percentage continued to have symptoms, and they went on for years, and they essentially became incapacitated and never could find any medical explanation. They didn't have the infectious disease that the other patients had at the time. So it's a complicated business, and I mean, you get involved in that. I mean, again, the symptoms are as real as if you had the infectious disease. So you to say, oh, it's all in your head, you don't worry about it. Well, that's not going to help these people one bit, and that's what often happens.
And linked to that, the one person that stood out for me was this English psychiatrist Simon Wesley, who had devoted his career to studying this illness, but had to abandon it because of the militancy of the patient groups. What happened there? How did they become so militant?
Well, he made the mistake in it was, I guess, 1989. He wrote a paper where he compared a group of patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, and then in the high 30s, around 40 in each group, patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, another group of patients with neuromuscular diseases such as myasthenia gravis and some genetic muscular diseases and so forth, and a group of patients with severe major depression. And he gave them all these extensive questionnaires. Regarding fatigue, he focused on two kinds of fatigue: was body fatigue and mind fatigue.
Okay.
Ask him about that. And all three groups had complained of body fatigue, but only the chronic fatigue syndrome patients and the major depressions complained of mind fatigue as well. And he in addition, he noted that there were a lot of similarities between the patient group that had chronic fatigue syndrome and the ones with major depression. They were much closer together in the questionnaire kind of responses than the group with neuromuscular diseases. And so they just pointed that out. They didn't try to make any judgments about what was the actual cause. They simply said that there are a lot of similarities between patients with chronic fatigue syndrome and patients with chronic major depression. And that led to an immediate backlash from the chronic fatigue community. And he, despite the fact he emphasized that the symptoms are real. He felt that the symptoms that they had were as real as the people with the neuromuscular disorders. And he by no means felt that there was, any making up of symptoms or such, but it's just this need for their symptoms to be medically explained and that they were biological. They were not willing to accept any psychosocial aspect to them. So that they hounded him, and he was there are a lot of examples of where he just decided it was not something he wanted to deal with him.
I think there's some similarity with probably more recent issue, chronic Lyme disease, and patient groups, I think, sometimes taking strong action to defend the diagnosis, which
It's similar. Again, that's a similar kind of thing, but that has a little more specific in a sense that they're claiming they have Lyme disease, whereas, well, with the chronic fatigue syndrome now, mostly they're deciding that they have immunological disease, which they may well have, but it's a psychoimmunological disease, right? But the immunological system is affected, just as I'm sure that Lyme disease patients have something that mimics and is similar to what people with Lyme disease have, and it becomes extremely difficult to separate these out. And I think you just have to deal with them as a spectrum, as I said, as a continuum, and then but to provide reassurance. I mean, I think the big problem for physicians is not to go to the other extreme where you're going to use some unproven treatment that just because the patient wants it, which is what happens in a lot of these cases. I think that you have to try to explain to them that that's not going to be more harmful than beneficial.
One last question on psychogenic illness. Are there people who are relatively resistant to it if there's a kind of an epidemic going on? Have those who have not, or those who didn't have the symptoms, have they been studied to see if there's anything that makes them?
Why would some people more? There's certainly no question that some people are more resistant to any, as I said, any psychogenic symptom, and I'm sure that the genetic factors are important, but all psychosocial. I mean, their outlook, what they expect if they have reasons that they understand, and they don't expect that the symptoms are going to be significant, or their beliefs as such, what their knowledge is, the background, all of those things are going to be important. But I think the other end of it, though, I believe anybody it can happen. I mean, in the Havana syndrome book, we go into a lot of other examples of. There have been so many, you get so many variations on the theme, from mad gassers to whole communities being sure that there's someone going around releasing dangerous gases and so forth. And certainly certain people are more susceptible, but it's not necessarily level of sophistication, although that's one factor. I mean, certain groups of people would be much more susceptible to some really bizarre thing, whereas maybe others would be less. But given the circumstances, just about everybody could be affected, I would.
And a question that just came to my mind is there any relationship between mass psychogenic illness and the culturally based illnesses that kind of affect specific people? Like, I think
the psychogenic illness. What other illness? I'm sorry?
Culture-based syndromes. So
cultural-based.
Yeah, culture-based. Something like the jumping Frenchman of Maine.
Well, I mean, some people would consider that a mass psychogenic illness that again that affects a particular culture or society. There's no question that certain culture, I mean, particularly there are examples of what beliefs is culture. That if a culture has certain beliefs, and in our book on Havana, we have several examples that have certain bizarre kinds of beliefs that led to really strange degrees of symptoms and so forth. So no question, depending on your background, your cultural beliefs, what you expect, can affect how you react to these things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the lesson I've taken is that it's complicated. It's not straightforward.
I think it is, and that's of course why we are where we are, where it's still a big problem.
We're kind of rounding up now. What 3 lessons would you want readers to take away from the book?
Well, I think everyone's susceptible. That's something I've emphasized. The symptoms are real. They're real, and as real as any kind of symptoms can be. And the truth is, I mean, in terms of helping these people, the worst thing you can do is overestimate the significance, and the best thing you can do for them, if you can show and you convince yourself and them that there are no signs of anything dangerous going on, provide reassurance. And if you look at the outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness, the ones that were dealt with the best and were handled the best were the physicians were aware of the syndrome early on. It was one of their differentials early on. And as they evolved and they found less evidence for anything else, when they start reassuring the patients and their families, that's when it started to become clear that it was a mass psychogenic illness, and people accepted it. Mm. But if you have people who don't even want to consider it, and if that's the majority, then we really get into problems.
3 key lessons. And what would you say with regards to mass psychogenic illness? What are the big questions that haven't been answered?
Well, I mean, obviously, we don't understand psychosocial aspects of brain function as much as we would like to, but that's very difficult. And I think that in time, I think it will become clear because we continue to more and more understand how the brain works and how the aspects of the brain. But I think that's one of the remarkable things we realize. There are a lot of flaws in our brains. They're related to our evolutionary past that we are dealing with, and we have to understand that and accept that we have flaws that we have to be aware of, and so that we can deal with.
And we've talked about your books. The one that you haven't given me a name is the one on exercise and the brain. What is that about?
Oh, exercise for brain. Actually, my most recent book has just come out. It's called Brain Electricity. That's within the last week.
Okay.
Brain Electricity, the interwoven history of electricity and neuroscience.
Okay.
I've always had an interest in electricity as a boy, even because my father was into it in a great way. So that the history of electricity and the history of neuroscience are tightly interrelated. And I start back in the many thousand years ago, and then we work up to the present time, up to the end of the 20th century, looking at both the history of electricity and of neuroscience and how they closely have been interrelated and continue to be right up to the present time. So that was my most recent book. The book before that was Exercise for the Brain. There I try to explain why the exercise is so important for a healthy brain and for brain function. And I go back and historically look at how it evolved, and then up to the present day, how exercise for the common neurologic diseases like dementia, stroke, and all the common how exercise can be helpful both to prevent and how to even use to treat patients who suffered from various neurological problems. So that's the exercise for the brain.
2 good books to look forward to.
Hopefully somebody will read them. I spent a lot of time writing.
I'm going to publicize it in this podcast. I'll get the images for the video. And what projects are you working on at the moment? Are you on any big thing?
Well, it's a little strap. I really got interested in the relationship between neuroscience and the supernatural in the 17th and 18th century. This is some unbelievably interesting how scientists in that region were in that time frame were so much affected by what was thought to be supernatural, and using some of the scientific discoveries, it made them think that supernatural things such as communicating with the dead and so forth could be and was possible. And some of the leading scientists scientists. We're talking some of the real prominent scientists of the world were very much into this, and it's so I've been reading. What I do is I just read a lot and try to then, once I decide, I start writing. But I haven't started to write yet about that. It's whether I'm going to go, but it is fascinating stuff. William James, the American father of psychology,
Yes.
had a medium living with him, and he was very strong. And William Crookes, the famous English scientist who essentially discovered the cathode ray tube, which is the predecessor for TV and actually finding the electron. He was a fanatical psychologist, psychophysiologist. He started the British, with one of the key people in the British Parapsychology Society, and he thought that you could study the mediums and that, and he believed. I mean, this is one of the things that just it's mind-boggling to me that these smart scientists, I mean, these were people who really did a lot of important things in science, but they were completely hoodwinked by these mediums, and even though they often would publish how they were doing these things later on, and it was essentially fraud, but they were just enamored with it, and they became convinced all the way up through their life that it was real and that you could actually communicate with spirits. It was rather interesting.
Well, we'll look forward to that in print.
Possibly.
Okay. Finally, are there any books you would like to recommend?
The couple that I thought the classic in this area is one by Edward Shorter, Shorter. Edward Shorter. It's called From Paralysis to Fatigue: A History of Psychosomatic Illness in the Modern Era. That's actually the modern era was up to 1992 when he published it. But his whole thing is that hysteria evolved from mostly physical symptoms such as paralysis and seizures, and that to much more subtle subjective symptoms in our modern times, such as headache, dizziness, fatigue, making it much more difficult to deal with and recognize. And in the other, I really enjoyed Andrew Scull, Scull, Hysteria, the Disturbing History. That was from 2009. It is just remarkable reading the history of hysteria, and some of the stories that he tells are just fascinating.
Interesting. I thought I knew enough books about hysteria, but clearly they're both.
He's actually a Southern California emeritus professor as well. So he is well known in the historical field, and that book is just fascinating reading for anybody. It's not, you don't have to be a physician or to be interested in it. It's really a fascinating story.
One to check out. Dr. Baloh, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and it looks like we've just scratched the surface. So I might call you back at a future time, perhaps when I've had a look at your more recent books. And to my audience, thank you very much for watching or listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, why not subscribe to the YouTube, Spotify, or iTunes channel so that you don't miss the next episode. And whilst waiting for the next episode, you might want to check out my book, Surfing the Brain, and I have a neurology database called Neuro Checklist. But until the next time, thank you very much for your time. And Dr. Baloh, I'm very, very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.